Good afternoon and good evening. So today I will talk about epistemic network modeling of pre-service teachers' STEM teaching competence through collaborative learning design. So first I will talk a little bit about my background, what is my research focus, and how I get to use QE in my research. So my research focuses on problem solving. There are so many professions that require complex problem solving of rare problems. However, our school system faces some challenges to prepare our students to develop professional expertise. So the purpose of my study is to investigate novel ways of cultivating students to think and act like a professional expert, mainly using problem-solving based learning approach. So what is expertise? The long-standing tradition of studying expertise tells us it's like a black box. Many scholars look at expertise from different perspectives. For example, to compare novice expert differences regarding knowledge structure and problem-solving strategies. Even expert can be classified into two types, named routine expert and adaptive expert. The latter is more favored for the flexible and innovative application of knowledge to enrich and refine their understanding. Dreyfus' famous stage model actually depicts expertise development trajectory in general. And Kitchen's argument of expertise lies in the connection between problem solving and knowledge construction, which means learning and doing can reciprocate each other and should not be separated. Then we have David stressed the comprehensive relations of expertise elements beyond just cognitive aspects, called epistemic frame. So another side of the coin is how we can foster expertise development. That is to identify key features of expertise development, including relevant instructional strategies or learning design principles, such as deliberate practice. And we are still having ongoing debate about the effectiveness of problem-based learning or teacher as facilitators. And the cognitive apprenticeship model that can be incorporated in authentic and simulated problem-solving learning environment can also be used to develop expertise. Or using mental representations to help learners build mental models and so on. So obviously, externalizing our modeling expertise plays a critical role of both assessment and instruction. So much influenced by this book, edited by Simon and two other scholars, in my PhD studies, I focused on designing e-learning environment incorporating visualization-based cognitive tools, such as integrating concept map and argument map to externalize students' knowledge construction and problem-solving processes during complex problem-solving learning. So this is a great way of learning to stimulate mental model visualization, but not all learners are easily get used to the map drawing first. And second, the structuredness of cognitive tool can afford or constrain how students think and act, which can be both good and problematic. For example, how to represent non-cognitive aspect of learning. So another big strand of mental representation study focused on a more naturalistic way, language. We also have plenty of techniques to analyze people's saying, reflecting their understanding and competence. And I'm very glad to have the opportunity to visit David's lab 3 years ago to learn more about QE and ENA that belongs to this family of methods. And I have tried to apply QE method in various complex problem-solving domains to address the big question of how to develop disciplinary thinking. For example, the data literacy, clinical reasoning, teachers design thinking, and computational thinking, and teachers design thinking. So in today's talk, I would like to share what we have done so far in teacher education field to prepare student teachers the ability to design integrated STEM lesson plan. So different from traditional school curriculum, STEM learning is interdisciplinary learning that requires integration of science inquiry, technological literacy, math thinking, and engineering design. So distinct features of STEM learning include student-centered, competence-oriented, and situated learnings. So the requirement of STEM education asks for teachers' competence development. For example, the shift of teaching belief and practice from more teacher-centered to more student-centered pedagogy. The extension of STEM-related TPAC, which means technological, pedagogical, and content knowledge around STEM learning, as well as design thinking similar to those required in other design fields. So here we are talking about teacher as learning designer instead of knowledge providers. But the challenge is that this is not usually trained in teacher education program, especially in China, because our pre-service teacher training is still discipline-based. You enter the math faculty in normal university and is trained to be a math teacher. First. And second, the predominant pedagogy in K-12 classroom is still teacher-centered for many reasons, you know. To me, STEM learning design is kind of ill-structured problem because collaborative learning in STEM education requires probabilistic design views to address the emergent, complex, and idiosyncratic interactions among different student groups. STEM learning design also, unlike the classic model of instructional design, such as ADDIE, which follows a well-structured step-by-step linear sequence, but relies on deep understanding of design principles and creativity in implementing those principles into appropriate teaching strategies. Besides, the STEM learning design often takes risks that novice teachers fail to link learning outcomes back to the goals of STEM learning, or as Wiggins and McTighe indicated, the traditional instructional design focuses more on the inputs. They suggest that learning designers consider learning outcomes before deciding on the approaches to teaching and learning, called backward design. So STEM lesson planning requires these iterative cycles of design and redesign, as well as reflective practice that is design thinking. It's both complex and creative processes. Also, many studies have indicated that teachers perform better when planning lessons collaboratively than individually. So in this study, we had 24 second-year undergraduate students major in education technology, and they have completed this capstone project in the course called Introduction to the Learning Sciences. The participants had no prior instructional design experience. They were classified into 6 groups with 4 students per group and further assigned into 2 conditions. One is static scaffolding cohorts, one is adaptive scaffolding cohort. They will complete 7 online sessions, 1 face-to-face sessions, 1.5 hours design discussion per session. And we use ENA to analyze their design discussion during these 7 tasks. So we adopt the idea of virtual internship in STEM teacher training. So in a fictitious primary school, the pre-service teachers were required to design a school-based STEM learning module. The online environment had some features, like modeling the backward STEM design procedure via design task description, and form design groups to do collaborative design, offering cognitive tools to guide learning design and tutoring support during design discussions. When we consider the tutoring support, this is a major challenge for the tutors to monitor different groups and guide their design just in time. And the previous study indicated that software scaffold can provide predefined question prompts related with every design tasks. But other scholars do believe adaptive scaffolds by human tutors can offer more contingent support. So we designed these 2 types of scaffolding conditions. The static scaffold provided the guided question at the beginning of each design discussions while adaptive scaffolding provided by the tutor, human tutors, ask the same guided questions during the design meetings. And the 3 stages of backward design were further divided into 8 design tasks. Like in the first stage, they need to define the authentic problems, identify the learning goals. And in the second stage, they need to design the learning evidence and learning assessment, and also refine their first draft. And in the final stage, they need to further design their learning activities, affordances, and wrap up the final lesson plan in the third stage. So this is a kind of a STEM lesson plan example. I'm sorry it's in Chinese characters, but you can get some kind of flavor about how it looks like. It's actually automatically generated from there using the lesson plan tools to do the design solutions. So my question is, how do STEM pre-service teachers develop their design thinking competence collaboratively on the static scaffold and adaptive scaffold? And we can kind of generate these coding schemes focusing on 10 aspects. First is because this is a collaborative problem solving, collaborative lesson design. So we focus on their lesson design processes. And also we focus on the social aspect of lesson design. And then the STEM topic, the learning assessment, design of the learning activity and learning goals, and also the 4 subjects. So this is kind of typical interaction patterns from the static scaffolding cohort. So you can see that the first line, the member actually usually repeats the guiding questions proposed by the proposed by the static scaffolds, and the members who usually follows the passive interaction mode to answer those guided questions. And usually some other members will agree their answers with no change. The static scaffold seems to suppress the divergent thinking and encourage the group to reach a consensus prematurely. So this is another example from this group. The mix and match strategy was widely used. For example, line 1, the member suggested revising their design based on another member's design solution. And in line 4, the members later said that they could combine 2 other members' assessment design into together. However, they did not elaborate much on their design rationale. As some members in line 11 later pointed out, the design criteria proposed were not systematic, but they failed to find out a better way to justify their solution. So this excerpt shows strong connections between learning assessment and other elements of STEM learning design, which is a critical step in the backward STEM learning design. To some extent, the static scaffolding forced the development of routine expertise by modeling design process. The group was more willing to assign subtasks to individual members and adopt a cooperative strategy to complete the overall design work. And this is an excerpt from adaptive scaffolding groups. So their STEM learning topic was amusement park design. And in line 5, the tutor identified incongruous views and asked the group members to reflect on their previous experience of design learning goals. And in line 6, a group member had the opportunity to elaborate on their opinion and negotiate the solutions with her group members. And finally, in line 11 and 12, the groups agreed on a right version that combines the strengths of 2 seemingly contradictory design solutions. So this excerpt shows comprehensive connections between STEM learning themes, learning goals, activity design, which reflect a more coherent learning design solutions. The human tutor not only proposed the guided questions, more adaptively, but also point out important issues emerging from group discussion to direct the group members' attention and trigger cognitive conflict resolutions. So from the ENA, we show that the overall subtraction network reveals that the static scaffolding cohort in red showed stronger connections between science subject with design process, learning assessment, technology, math element, located on the right-hand side of the projected space, which emphasized the importance of line disciplinary knowledge with design process and assessment. Whereas the adaptive scaffolding cohort showed strong connections with learning themes, the learning goals, activities, and engineering. So located on the left-hand side of the projected space, which reflected a situated and more goal-oriented projected-based STEM lesson plan. So by looking at their network difference across different design tasks, we find that adaptive scaffold groups and static scaffold group differed in their focus on STEM learning design dimensions, but showed comparable connection strengths at the first stage. However, during the progress of design activities, the adaptive scaffolding cohort developed stronger and more comprehensive connections than the static scaffolding cohort from task 2 to 6. Only until task 7, static scaffold outperformed adaptive scaffold group in building more connections. From task 2 to 6, the adaptive scaffold showed a clearer design patterns shifting from connections with learning goals to learning themes, learning assessment, learning activities, and finally interdisciplinary knowledge than the static scaffolding groups. The results suggest that although the two cohorts received the same guided questions, the cohort with adaptive scaffolding built more productive connections between the design elements by referring back to the previous design steps, such as iterative design patterns can help to build a more integrated STEM lesson plan. So the central trajectory confirms that both cohorts followed the general backward design processes of moving from STEM topic, context design, to learning assessment design, and finally to the detailed learning activity design and the learning resources design. And we also measured the projected central distance, which revealed increasing divergent design patterns, except for task 5, which is refine the draft design solution, and task 7, which is the final wrap up of their refinement. Regarding the overall network difference, as I showed before, the divergent trajectory further suggests the static scaffold groups had their design thinking moving towards a more process-oriented, whereas the adaptive scaffold group and moving towards a more product-oriented design patterns. So to summarize, the scaffolding group actually focus on the backward step learning design processes and establish initial vocabulary of STEM lesson plan for developing their design thinking, while adaptive scaffolding group focus on more holistic and interdisciplinary STEM learning design solutions. And STEM learning design requires more than a formalized design process, such as conflict identification and resolution, and creative designs as a co-evolution of problem and solution can be formulated through back and forth between different design elements. And adaptive scaffolding and the static scaffolding play different roles and should complement each other to balance the flexibility and the structure needs. So the static scaffolding in the form of guided questions provided at the beginning of each design tasks can easily routinize the backward design process and draw designers' attention to critical steps and design principles, foster design knowledge synthesis, and improve preserve teacher self-efficacy and competence in their lesson plan work. While adaptive scaffold help engage group members to share different perspectives and negotiate to reach a more coherent design outcomes, it can better regulate iterative and reflective design thinking, address the emergent concerns of a design group, and promote flexibility in the design process and its results. Further, we're kind of curious about the relations between their design process and design artifact. that is STEM lesson plan. And besides, we know that previous teachers' previous learning experience usually teacher-centered. As some researchers argued, the teaching beliefs underlying teaching behavior may not be easily changed. So we hypothesize that the STEM design requires unlearning traditional way of teaching to create new type of STEM learning. So we further investigated design process of two quite distinct groups based on their quality of STEM lesson plan. So we tried to develop a STEM lesson plan evaluation criteria based on some existing STEM competence framework. One is from the United States STEM education quality framework, and one is from STEM teacher competence standards from National Institute of Education Science in China. Then the two teacher educators assessed the lesson plan based on these 8 criteria, and we chose from adaptive scaffolding cohorts, one high-performing group and one low-performing group. So one major difference in high-performing group is high-performing group had more authentic engineering challenge in their lesson plan, while the low-performing group solution is still knowledge-oriented. In this study, we kind of revise our original coding scheme to combine 4 subject codes into one code and remove the code about social aspect of design processes to make it more succinct. So the high-performing group, we can see from the network triggered the STEM learning design from describing authentic learning context, took outcome-based design solutions and emphasized on the learning assessment, while the low-performing group tend to design STEM learning around disciplinary knowledge and design learning activities around knowledge understandings. Then we look at the 5 stages, from first to middle to the final stages. The high-performing groups followed the backward design processes to consider the learning outcomes and assessment before activity and affordance design, while low-performing group still chose to design activities in details first and then consider how to evaluate students' learning performance. So we have found evidence of consistency between their design process and design artifacts that reflecting more STEM learning favored features or traditional disciplinary learning favored features, which seems to corroborate our hypothesis that teaching beliefs plays some kind of roles to influence STEM learning design. So these are some preliminary findings of our study, and I'm very happy to answer your questions and get comments and feedbacks. But before that, I also have 2 questions that expect further discussions. So we can see that many studies nowadays mention about aligning learning analytics with learning design. So how can QE inform effective learning design for professional expertise development? The second is when I share my study with STEM teachers, they often expect to see valid instrument for assessment purpose. So how can ENA be used for formative and dynamic assessment of professional competence? For example, teacher STEM lesson plans or student STEM lesson learning performance. So that's all for my presentations. Thank you all.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Bian.
Thank you.
The joy of online, you can hear one person clapping. But lots of people clapping. Okay, right. Well, that was a very nice presentation. There's a lot of work there. It's always tough to compress that into just a short summary, and I'm sure that has whetted people's appetites to go and read your papers and see the detail.
Okay.
Some very nice examples of how you showed the time snapshots of the ENA changing. Which is very compelling. So I'm sure there are lots of questions in mind. Does anybody want to post a question to the chat or put your hand up by clicking on the blue the blue hand in the participant panel, and then we'll just allow you to ask your question. So have a little think. While you're thinking, I'll kick off with one just to think about. So what you're finding is that when you have a human, as not an artificial intelligent agent, but a real human engaging in the conversation with the students, then obviously that had beneficial effects. So are you interested in trying to understand what the human tutor was doing in order to try and scale that into some kind of, smart learning environment, which is better than just the static questions handed out to the students?
Yeah, I think from my reading their chattings, discussions, I find that they kind of establish this rely on the human tutors. They can be assured that someone will guide them to give them the confidence of doing these lesson plan activities, because they have no prior experience in instructional design. But in the static scaffolding groups, sometimes they cannot figure out what they are wrong or right, so they kind of have lost feelings. So they can only follow the routines of doing this work. So these are the biggest difference between these two types of groups.
Right. Yeah, because learning to do this backward learning design where you start with the outcomes and then think about the design of the tasks and etc. That's counterintuitive. And so the human tutor is providing that scaffolding about the process, I imagine. Yeah. David, throwing to you.
Yeah, well, you know me, I always have questions. Actually, I want to start with just some comments, because there was a ton of really great things in the talk, and I know we've been partly the meta discussion around these webinars is also like how to think about communicating QE ideas. I mean, one thing I'm struck by, I'm looking at you, Mike Phillips, is like teaching is so hard. Like learning to teach well is I think people don't appreciate how hard it is. And I remember when we were doing our own work on virtual internships, that you've been connected to Bian. Like no matter what we did, somebody always said, because we were in education, like, could you do a virtual internship for teacher training? And we always said, no, that's way too hard. Like we don't want to touch that. So I applaud you just for taking that on. Another thing that I really liked about this was the way that you really walked us carefully through the ethnographic data first. There's been some discussion in the QE community about the importance of putting the E in QE, right? It doesn't really work if you just use the quantitative ethnographic tools and aren't actually presenting some kind of grounded understanding. Are we still doing that? Are we still doing that session, Brendan? Or did that get put on the cutting room floor? We talked about holding a workshop called putting the E in QE.
The interpretation one should get towards that too.
Yeah. Okay.
But
right,
maybe
yeah,
at ISQE 20.
Yeah, you can say more about that then. So I just wanted to highlight that as something that was really good. And then another thing that I really enjoyed was seeing the trajectories. And seeing several different ways that you looked at them, in particular the kind of summary view with the trajectories drawn through the points, and then also walking us through the individual pieces of the trajectory, and then even looking at the timing by which certain connections got made, which Arudis Foster has done some of that, a little bit of that in his work, but I haven't seen much of that. I've seen the kind of trajectories drawn, and I've seen occasionally people sort of showing change over time, but I've rarely seen somebody go in and sort of point out that like this connection gets made first and then that one, so on. So I saw that was really cool. I have have two questions. One is a selfish one, and one is actually an interesting one.
Mhm.
Let me start with the selfish one first. So I noticed in the data that you, like that first piece of data, there was all this I agree going on.
Mhm.
Was that kind of persist throughout the data? Did you like was there a lot of sort of people just saying agreement but not elaborating on things?
Yeah, it's kind of in the study cohort, scaffolding cohort, this is kind of a typical patterns because they have kind of guided questions. So they will narrowly focus on these questions, and they kind of have more convergent thinking about these things. So when some students answer the questions, others usually they will agree with these answers. They don't have many divergent thinkings in this way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so here's what was behind that question. If it's happening all the time, like I've wondered for a long time what to do when somebody says I agree, right? Because there's two ways of thinking about what to just how to think about that conceptually, right? Do we just say, look, I'm not coding that for anything in terms of like my qualitative codes because they didn't actually say the thing, you know, the things that I'm looking for? Or do we say, well, you just agreed with what the previous person said, so that's essentially you saying something similar, right? In which case, we should give you credit for the codes from the line before. And we've, Brendan, maybe you can talk later if there's time, but I think you didn't you do some looking at that problem? But I'm just wondering, Bian, how you were thinking about that, because it occurs to me that if you code the agrees as essentially the same thing as what was in the previous line, then you would actually see convergence because people's ENA models would move together. If you just code them as basically zeros, then you're not actually seeing convergence in the ENA, even though that's the thing that you're sort of claiming qualitatively is happening. So I'm just wondering how you, if you thought about that, and if so, what your thinking is about it.
In my study, I code it's like more like social dimensions, because I think.
I see.
Can you hear?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So because they more kind of not to challenge too much to make someone lose his face, you know, and they also want to make these tasks working more smoothly. So this is, I think, their first concern about why they want to agree with these kind of.
I see. So you coded for it directly. That was the solution to the problem. You coded for the convergence. Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
Good answer.
Okay. Can I pass it over to Carl? He has a question. You can unmute yourself. You're still muted. Oh, sorry. I thought we had okay, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Okay, thank you. That's a great presentation. And it's a scary one to me. It scares me because I used to be a teacher in the university in China. When I was a teacher, when I taught in colleges, I prepared by my lectures just in the freestyle. I never knew that I need to design the lecture in such a complicated way. So that is why it seems scary. What if I were a teacher now? Do I have to go through that? Just kidding. I mean, yeah, I do agree with David. This is teaching is a very complicated job. And it's kind of interesting. David mentioned agree issue because we just hours ago, Brenda and I talked to Karen from Washington University. We were talking about the kind of agreement, like such kind of things. How do we code that, or should we just escape this? I guess this will be a very common problem in the conversation data. So how we should do that? We should have some common. Obviously, they have value in it. Like David said, if I say I agree, looks like I'm just represent what you said. which means everything coded in that line should be coded here, or this is completely different thing. So these are different issues we may need to consider in the future. One minor thing I want to raise is I see you presented some group differences. I'm asking questions so that you have a chance to tell us more. And but I didn't see the statistics. Are those differences significant or just minor differences? Because if you have two groups, you can always say two different networks, but how different they are, I'm just curious. Again,
Yeah.
this is implementation.
Okay, thank you, Zhiqiang. Yeah. So we did find significant difference between these two groups because they actually from both by reading their chat data, we find these kind of typical design patterns, and we use ENA, which can show their confidence intervals of their centroid point of the networks, and we find this significant difference in the overall design networks. But when we look at their design trajectory, we do see that they are becoming more divergent. Seems that the difference become more larger at a later stage because one group is more process-oriented way of thinking about the design work, and another is more outcome-based, outcome-oriented way of thinking. So these are quite distinctive features of these two types of groups.
Okay, all right, thank you. Sylvie, you have a question.
Hi, Bian.
Hi.
Thanks for that great presentation. I have two questions actually. One was you had this really interesting visual entitled "Distance Between Two Trajectories," and I was wondering if you could walk us through what that actually meant in your specific project. And then I have another question, but I'll leave that for later.
Okay, so I'm just curious about we do find the subject networks of their general design tasks to see that one group, the static scaffolding groups, they focus more on some disciplinary knowledge and the design process, whereas adaptive scaffolding focus more on designing a more coherent, integrated, project-based STEM learnings. So these are kind of the general difference between these two cohorts, but we don't know how they developed, and we use this measure of the central point to actually figure out that the difference is quite like progressively developed. They become more and more oriented towards process-based design work and more outcome-based design work. So this is why we use distance measures to see they are developing these trajectories.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Can I ask my other question too? Do you have?
Yeah, sure.
You had, if I saw correctly, you had in one network codes that refer to the topics of certain classes, and then you had other codes to represent interaction and that sort of thing?
Yes.
Did you consider using the topical codes like math and science, and I don't know what you had there? Did you consider using them as like grouping variables instead of putting them into the network itself?
This is a very good question because we do have another challenge when we did this kind of work, because in our first round of the study, we actually didn't ask the different groups to, we allow them to design different STEM topics. So they kind of have many different vocabulary because about their subjects are quite different. So this makes coding process more difficult actually, and we cannot find very consistent patterns even within the same scaffolding cohort because their topics are quite different. So in our second round of studies, we actually ask all groups to design the same topics, but they still have different types of design scaffoldings. And in this way, we kind of to look at the patterns more clearly. So this is what I actually do to address these problems. But I didn't do as you said. I think this is quite a good idea to see how the topics actually influence their performance. But this relates to my questions, that is, sometimes we find it's difficult to actually to give dynamic assessment, formative assessment during their design works. But if we ask them to give them too many opportunities to do different works, it will be more challenging to give a formative assessment for different groups using some ENA technologies. It will be more challenging work.
Yeah, it seems like there's a tension there. Sylvia, I like that idea too of potentially looking at, like, do you see different patterns based on what's being discussed? And I think it would fit nicely into the style that Bian used. I kind of want to echo what David said in terms of how, Bian, you presented different views of the same phenomena by taking different slices and saying, this is what I mean here, this is what I mean here, really showing us kind of how to go through. And I like what Sylvia was saying too. That's another cool way to do it. It would be a nice compliment. I wanted to circle back too to something that Carl and David mentioned related to what you were talking about too, Bian, in terms of like the agreement thing. I think it is kind of a sticky thing to figure out how to code for, especially given the dynamics of wanting people to be able to save face, trying to achieve a specific goal. And one of the things that David was mentioning in some of the work that we looked at before relates to transactivity. So how much does someone engage with someone else's ideas? So if I say I agree with something, I'm engaging with your idea. But if I say I agree with this specific thing, that's a little bit higher level of engagement. I'm being explicit, which would get help with David's question of how do you code for it? Because we'd have that specific thing to code for. Or I agree with this, but not agree with that. And the other thing beyond transactivity and the levels of engagement that people could have with each other's ideas during a design process could also be this concept of agreeing or disagreeing. And we had one study where we were looking at basically different groups of people discussing a controversial topic. And so, or actually different controversial topics. And you could see there's opportunities for people to lose face or for there to be tension and stuff like that. And one of the things that we had two different hypotheses that we're working with. One was that it matters when people say they agree or they disagree. And that's really crucial. And another one was, well, it doesn't really matter if they say they agree or not. It's more about what are the specific codes that the themes that they're talking about, the ideas that they're talking about. And the long and the short of that is, to cut to the chase, basically in one study, it didn't matter. So that hypothesis held that the difference between these two groups was still there regardless of whether you put in agreement or not. But for another question, it did matter. It really did matter which specific things they were saying they agreed with or not. So that's kind of a slightly separate thing. Both of those are related, but a little bit separate to what David was talking about in terms of how do we decide to code for the agreement, the transactivity and how deeply they pick up an idea, that helps with that. But I think it also depends on the rest of the constellation of codes you're looking at and what level those are cast at. So I think it can matter, and it could be a fun thing to explore. Anyway, so that was a bunch, but also just awesome. I really appreciate getting to see you walk through everything. It was great.
Okay.
Thank you, Brandon.
Mike, you've got your hand up. Sylvia, you've still got your hand up. I don't know whether that means you want to come back on something, but I'll pass to Mike.
It's up because I can't lower it. Could you do it for me? Sorry.
Yeah, Zoom just disables us in certain ways, doesn't it? Okay, Mike.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Bian. This is a fascinating topic and one that I'm really interested in. And David and Brendan and others, thanks for raising the idea about agreeing with somebody else. And I want to sort of add a potentially different kind of an idea in this particular example. So if I'm not sure in China, the histories of educational histories of students, but at least here in Australia, typically we find students will come from a particular discipline area and then will do their teacher education work. So you'll have somebody who's done a science degree or an engineering degree or similar.
Yeah.
I think you had a really nice diagram as part of your presentation where you were talking about science inquiry, technological literacy, mathematical thinking, and engineering design, and the different ways different disciplines think about their content, think about the way in which they present information. And so I'm wondering where we have a situation where somebody says, yes, I agree, in a STEM situation, an integrated STEM discipline, whether disciplinary expertise or naivety means that I'd be more likely to agree with David if it's a mathematical kind of a question or problem that we're trying to solve, and he's the mathematical expert and I have more of the technological side of things. Maybe did you think about that at all in terms of grouping people together? Or
because in these studies, the participants are all recruited from the same majors, so they don't have much a different background. So I would like to kind of doing this kind of study, as you mentioned, to include students from different discipline backgrounds, so we can see that they're challenging each other, they have more argumentations, so their agree or disagree will be more related with David's comments that maybe there are another meanings in their terms.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Thank you. So it's a great study. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Can I ask you, on your final slide, you talked about the things you would like to do next, the kinds of questions you were raising. Now, one of them, which I think is a very exciting question, is about how could ENA help with dynamic formative assessment to close the feedback loop to these pre-service teachers. Now, in a couple of webinars in this series, people have been beginning to talk about showing ENA diagrams back to the people they were interviewing or studying. Now, I wondered whether you have any thoughts about that, or whether you are thinking about ENA enabling other kinds of feedback, but you don't want to actually show people these networks. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I do show the networks to some teaching research staff in our specific communities, and they kind of understand the whole process of how I generate these ENA networks and understand this meaning, but they also agree that the major challenge is about the coding process. It's kind of difficult for the teachers to do these kind of works. And for example, in STEM educations, they would like to see if there's a kind of general assessment tools that can be applied into their classrooms, but they cannot do these kind of coding works first. And second, it is kind of the learning curves for them to interpret their networks. So that this may get some trainings. But I think that later part is more easier than the formal part.
Right, okay. So you've shown it to your fellow colleagues who are doing research into teacher training, but you haven't shown it to the pre-service teachers themselves.
Not yet, yeah.
Right. And yeah, no, I understand what you're saying about the complexities of that. David, did you have a follow-up on some of those future-oriented questions Bian was highlighting?
Yeah, I do. I was just actually trying to find a paper that came out a little while ago. I think it was in the Learning Sciences Conference about an interface that was designed to make an actual ENA result more consumable for an end user. It was for teachers, not students, but and interestingly, Simon, it sort of did a little bit of just what you were saying. That is, it did show the interface, but it also showed what might be actionable from it, so that you didn't have to do all of the work of interpreting, yourself. I'll see if I can find the link.
Yeah, that was the LAC 18 paper by Herder et al.
Yes, right. Yes, that's right. Yeah, if you have a link to it handy, maybe you could pop it in there. But so there is some prior art on that, and it was, what we discovered, by the way, is that the teachers didn't have enough time in the classroom to use more or less any kind of formative feedback on the fly. So I guess that's not so surprising. In terms of your other question, though, one of the things that we never did, and I'm trying to rack my brain now as to why we didn't, but I mean, it does strike me that you have the possibility here of essentially doing a kind of predictive model with the data that you have, right? So I'm sort of thinking, there are certain moves that the adaptive facilitators are making. They're choosing to ask certain questions at certain points in time. And I'm wondering whether the state of an ENA network or the trajectory of an ENA network leading up to that, perhaps in combination with the actual things that were just said recently, like whether there's a way of kind of predicting what what question the mentor is asking, right? And that might be a way of kind of moving towards this integration. But I agree with you. The coding thing is really problematic, and that's why we started worrying about questions of epistemic frames, and we wound up having to build coding tools, because we realized that if you couldn't solve that problem, then you couldn't you couldn't do anything writ large. So I that's absolutely the kind of at the center of things. That's why Sylvie's doing developing rock, and we clearly need a better way to get a grip on that. The alternatives of topic modeling are just really problematic, especially if you're trying to do something in a classroom where there's some stakes involved in the sort of feedback that you give. So, I don't know if that's helpful, but that's at least one thought of something you could do.
Right. So one question I have, I mean, you've hinted at this already, Bian, that you have been sharing this with your colleagues. I'm wondering, can you comment a little bit about what kind of reception this analysis is getting from the different kinds of research communities or practitioner communities that you engage with? What do people think about this kind of analysis? Is it, we like to discuss that in this webinar because all of us are talking about this kind of work to people who may be unfamiliar with it. Can you say a bit about that?
Yes, I have been also communicate with some other researchers who are curious to know more about QE ENA, and they would also want to make comparison between the ENA and the social network analysis, or we say the transition state analysis of as a sequential analysis. To see the difference between this new method with a previous related method. So these are the major concerns. What's the difference, and what's the result will tell about by using ENA. So I think this is also another major topic. How we can compare different research methods, or even complement or integrate different methods to give comprehensive understanding of the situations.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, that brings us beautifully up to the hour. So let's thank Bian one more time for that presentation. I know that, so thank you very much. Brendan, I know you wanted to put in a quick advert for something that may be of interest to everybody.
Yeah, hold on one second. Let me put it into the chat here. So we are going to be hosting a lot of people from around the world are going to be hosting a QE event coming up in about a week and a half. I just put a link to the event in the chat. We're calling it a Curious Meetup, but basically the hope is to get people to connect more people across the QE community, develop new skills. So there's going to be workshops and specific events. So you can take a little bit of a closer look there, but it should be great. A lot of the people from the early career workshop and the doctoral consortium from ICQE 19 are helping to run it. There's going to be, I think Sylvie and GJ are going to be giving kind of a workshop on rock, which will be cool. And if you're interested in doing that, you check that out for this and then come to ICQE 20 and get like a more in-depth one. There's going to be one about like this is related to what David was saying about putting the E in QE. How do we interpret QE models? Bian gave a really great example of showing, look at this connection, here's where it's happening. After he showed us what that looked like in the qual data itself. So we're pretty excited about it. We have a bunch of mentors that have signed up to help people. It is first come, first serve. So you might want to jump on the registration, but it's a way to help people prepare for if they're trying to finish a study or submit to the next ICQE conference or whatever it is. That's kind of the hope, connecting each other and helping to continue to develop skills and produce more good research like we saw today.
Fantastic. So that's the chance to go much more deeply into this kind of work. Were there any other announcements that I have forgotten, David, Brendan? No, that's
just the next, we've got the next webinar, right?
Yeah, sure. So that's my final point. The last one of the year is from Roberto Martinez Maldonado, who's at Monash University in Melbourne on the 3rd of December. So about 1 month from now, same time. And Roberto will be talking about what happens when we try and take a quantitative ethnography approach to multimodal data, which is studying embodied learning rather than online learning. So that adds a new layer of interest and complexity. All right, so thanks very much for coming, everybody. Thanks again to Bian, who's got up very early for this presentation to us all. We really appreciate it. You can go back to bed now. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
And
thanks everyone for coming.
We'll see you in a month.